It is 7:25 in the morning, the 6th of June, 1944, and on a strip of sand near the village of La Rivière, on what the invasion planners are calling Gold Beach, a tank is driving out of the sea. Not landing, not being unloaded from a craft that has beached itself, driving out of the sea, under its own power, as if the English Channel were simply a very wide, very cold road. Its hull sits low in the water, ringed by a collapsed canvas screen that, moments earlier, had been standing upright like the gunwale of a small boat, giving this 30-ton Sherman tank enough buoyancy to swim. Spray comes off its tracks as they bite into the sand. Somewhere behind it, a second vehicle noses forward, and this one is stranger still. It has no gun barrel in the conventional sense, just a short, thick stub of a mortar, almost comically stubby, mounted where a 75mm gun should be. A few hundred yards down the beach, a third machine unrolls what looks like a giant timber carpet across the soft sand ahead of it, laying its own road as it goes. For more incredible true stories from World War II, carefully researched and brought to life, subscribe to the channel and never miss a new documentary. None of this should be happening. 19 months earlier, on a beach very much like this one, at a French port called Dieppe, British and Canadian tanks had come ashore and simply stopped working. Tracks shed on loose shingle, engines drowned in salt water. Whole squadrons sat immobile on the sand while the men who needed their covering fire died around them. The lesson the British Army drew from Dieppe, by most accounts, was blunt. Tanks cannot survive a contested beach landing on this kind of coast. And yet here, on Gold Beach, tanks are not only surviving, they are arriving before most of the infantry, clearing mines, filling ditches, and blasting concrete gun emplacements at point-blank range, while the men who are supposed to be defending this stretch of France are, in places, too stunned to fire back. This is not really a story about tanks that could swim. It's a story about what happens when an army is forced, by catastrophic failure, to actually learn something, and about the one man too stubborn and too strange for anyone to have chosen for the job, who happened to be exactly the person it needed. To understand why a swimming tank rolling up a Normandy beach counts as strange at all, you have to go back to Dieppe, in August 1942. The raid was meant to be a rehearsal, a way of testing, on a small scale, whether an armored force could seize a defended French port directly from the sea. It failed in almost every particular that mattered. Of the tanks that made it ashore at all, most were stopped cold by the loose fist-sized shingle that covered the beach. Their tracks simply couldn't get purchase, and several threw a track and sat immobile within yards of the water. Others hit a concrete seawall they had no way of climbing. Not a single tank made it off that beach and into the town it was meant to help capture. Nearly 1,000 Canadian soldiers were killed, and thousands more were captured, in an operation that lasted less than a day. Here is the first thing worth holding on to. The problem at Dieppe wasn't cowardice, and it wasn't bad luck. It was, when the post-mortems were finished, a problem of specification. The tanks used at Dieppe were general-purpose vehicles, built to fight in open country, asked to do a job, climbing a seawall, crossing loose shingle, surviving deep water, that nothing in their design had ever anticipated. If the next landing was going to succeed, someone was going to have to build machines for the specific, peculiar violence of an amphibious assault, rather than hoping ordinary tanks would improvise their way through it. That someone turned out to be a man the British Army had, only 2 years earlier, forced into retirement. Percy Hobart had spent the interwar years as one of the loudest and most persistent voices in Britain, arguing that armored warfare, fast-moving tanks working together, rather than tanks parceled out in small numbers to support infantry, was going to define the next war. He was, by most accounts of colleagues who served under him, brilliant, abrasive, and almost pathologically unwilling to soften his opinions for the comfort of senior officers who disagreed with him. In 1940, that combination of talent and temperament cost him his career. He was pushed out of the army and, at the age of 55, ended up serving as a corporal in the Home Guard, patrolling a stretch of English countryside with a rifle while younger men he had trained went off to fight. Winston Churchill, learning of this, was reportedly furious that a man of Hobart's abilities had been sidelined and intervened directly to have him reinstated. By October 1942, 2 months after the disaster at Dieppe, Hobart was given command of a new formation, the 79th Armoured Division. And here is the detail worth holding on to, because it changes everything about how you should picture what this division actually was. The 79th never fought as a division. It never massed its tanks together and drove at the enemy as a single armored fist. Instead, it became something closer to a workshop and a lending library, a pool of specialized vehicles developed under Hobart's direction that would be parceled out to whichever infantry or armored units needed them for a specific task, on a specific stretch of beach, on a specific morning. Before we get to what those machines actually were, and some of them are genuinely strange, it's worth pausing to say, if you're finding this kind of buried, half-forgotten engineering history as interesting as we do, this is exactly the sort of story this channel exists to dig up. So consider subscribing before we go further, because the next part is where it gets properly odd. Hobart's engineers took 2 existing tank designs, the American-built Sherman and the heavily armored British Churchill, and rebuilt them piece by piece for jobs no tank had ever been asked to do. The vehicles that came out of this process earned themselves a nickname among the troops who used them, Hobart's Funnies. The first Funny solved the problem that had, in a sense, started everything. How do you get a tank across open water and onto a beach without a landing craft doing all the work? The answer was the Duplex Drive tank, DD for short. A standard Sherman fitted with a canvas screen that could be raised around the hull like an inflatable collar, giving the vehicle just enough displacement to float, and a pair of propellers driven off the tank's own engine. Launched from a landing craft several thousand yards offshore, a DD tank would swim toward the beach under its own power, its crew commanding what was, for a few minutes, essentially a very heavy, very slow boat with a gun turret. Once it reached shallow water, the crew would drop the canvas screen, and the tank would simply drive out of the surf, ready to fight. The second Funny solved a different problem: mines. Advancing infantry couldn't sweep a beach for buried mines under fire, so Hobart's engineers built the Sherman Crab, a tank fitted with a rotating drum on the front, studded with lengths of chain that thrashed the ground ahead of the vehicle as it advanced, detonating mines before the tank's own tracks reached them. It was crude, loud, and by most accounts unpleasant to operate, but it meant a path through a minefield could be cleared at walking pace, under armor, rather than by a man on his stomach with a bayonet. Then there was the vehicle we glimpsed at the start of this story, with the stubby mortar instead of a gun. That was the Churchill AVRE, assault vehicle, Royal Engineers, and it was arguably the most important Funny of them all. In place of a conventional cannon, it carried a short-range spigot mortar, nicknamed the Petard, that fired a 40-pound charge the troops called the Flying Dustbin, lobbed perhaps 150 yards, capable of cracking open a concrete bunker that would have shrugged off ordinary tank fire. The AVRE could also be fitted with a bundle of logs called a fascine, dropped into an anti-tank ditch to fill it, or with the timber carpet device you saw unrolling across the sand, nicknamed the bobbin, designed to give following vehicles a solid surface to cross soft ground that would otherwise swallow their tracks whole. And there was one more Funny that deserves mention here, even though it stayed quietly in reserve for much of D-Day itself: the Churchill Crocodile, a tank towing an armored trailer holding several hundred gallons of fuel, connected to a flamethrower built into the hull with a range of well over 100 yards. By most accounts, its psychological effect on defenders in a bunker or trench line was often more decisive than its physical destructiveness. Men who would hold a position under artillery fire would abandon it rather than face the flame. Hold this thought, because it matters later. Not every one of these machines performed equally well, and not every commander who used them trusted them equally. That gap between the tanks that worked and the tanks that were trusted is going to become important. Part 4. The reveal that most people get backwards. Here is the detail that surprises people who assume this is simply a story about clever British engineering winning the day everywhere it was tried. The Americans, planning their own landings at Omaha and Utah beaches, were offered the Funnies and turned almost all of them down. The reasoning, as best the historical record shows, wasn't stubbornness so much as logistics. American planners were reluctant to introduce an entirely new tank type, the Churchill, into a supply chain already built around the Sherman, and were confident their own combat engineers could clear obstacles by more conventional means, with specialized demolition teams working under fire. They did adopt the DD swimming tank and a mine-clearing design of their own. Everything else they declined. At Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, where British and Canadian forces used the Funnies extensively, the results were striking. DD tanks launched close to shore, in places directly onto the beach itself when conditions were too rough for a longer swim, came ashore largely intact and were firing in support of the infantry within minutes of the first wave landing. AVREs cracked open bunkers that had survived the preceding naval bombardment untouched. Casualty rates on these beaches, while far from light, were substantially lower than commanders had feared going in. For more incredible true stories from World War II, carefully researched and brought to life, subscribe to the channel and never miss a new documentary. At Omaha Beach, the outcome was catastrophic. The 2 American tank battalions assigned to swim their DD tanks ashore made different decisions that morning. One battalion, judging the 4 to 5 foot swells too dangerous, carried its tanks directly onto the beach by landing craft and lost almost none of them. The other launched its tanks well offshore, as planned. Of the 29 DD tanks that went into the water, 27 sank within minutes, taking a considerable number of their crews down with them. Only 2 reached the beach under their own power. Infantry, who had been promised armored support in the first minutes of the assault, found themselves instead pinned on open sand beneath German positions that had barely been touched by bombs or naval gunfire, because the specialized beach-clearing armor that might have helped them simply wasn't there. Now, here is a popular misconception worth correcting directly, because it has hardened into something close to folk memory, partly thanks to a famous line of dialogue in a well-known war film. It is not true that every American tank sank at Omaha, or that no armor of any kind reached the beach that morning. Dozens of tanks did eventually make it ashore at Omaha. Some launched directly from their landing craft rather than swum in, and they played a real part in the eventual, desperately hard-won success of that landing. The idea that Omaha's tank force was wiped out to the last vehicle is an exaggeration. But the core of the story is not an exaggeration at all. A large fraction of the armor meant to support that first wave of infantry ended up on the seabed, and the men on the sand paid for it. It would be easy to end the story there, with a tidy moral. The British were right to build specialized armor, the Americans were wrong to decline it, and Omaha proved the point. But the real picture is messier, and the honest version of this story has to sit with that mess rather than smooth it over. The Funnies were not uniformly successful, even on the beaches where they were used. Some crab flail tanks detonated mines meant for infantry, but were themselves damaged or immobilized in the process, and flail crews reported that thick mud or deep obstacles could defeat the flailing mechanism entirely. At Sword Beach, DD tanks launched into rougher water than at Gold, or Juno suffered real losses of their own, just fewer than Omaha's. A difference of degree, not of design. Some infantry commanders on the ground, in the days after the landing, complained that the specialized vehicles were too few, too slow across certain terrain, or simply not where they were needed when a bunker needed cracking. And Hobart himself, for all his vindication, had spent the better part of 2 years fighting a British military bureaucracy that was slow, sometimes exasperatingly slow, to fund, trust, or properly integrate his designs before D-Day forced the issue. nor was the American decision as simple as blind stubbornness. Some senior American planners had genuine, defensible concerns about introducing a second tank chassis into an already strained logistics system just weeks before the largest amphibious invasion in history. And it's worth remembering that the DD tank concept itself, the one piece of the Funnies program the Americans did adopt, was the one that failed most badly at Omaha, largely because of a launch decision made on the morning itself rather than any flaw baked into the design. Even the informed side of this story, the planners who believed they understood the risk of a rough channel crossing, got the specific judgment call wrong that morning in a way that cost dozens of lives within minutes. Go back for a moment to that flail tank rolling up Gold Beach in the story's opening minutes. We don't know his name, and inventing one wouldn't serve the story, but by most accounts of the men who crewed these vehicles that morning, the driver of a crab tank in the first wave at Gold was likely no older than 22, trained for months on equipment that had, until recently, existed only as an experimental prototype and had almost certainly never fired a shot in anger before that morning. His job was to drive directly and deliberately into ground that might be mined, at a crawl, with a rotating drum of chains as his only defense against something he couldn't see. If the flail failed, or jammed, or simply missed a mine buried too deep, the outcome was his to absorb, not the infantry behind him. That is, in the end, what the specialized armor bought for the men who followed it onto these beaches. Not certainty, and not safety, but a narrower, more survivable version of an impossible morning. We began this story with a tank driving out of the sea where, by the lesson of Dieppe, no tank should have been able to survive at all. The answer to that puzzle isn't mysterious once you know it. It survived because a stubborn, difficult man who had been forced out of the army was given, almost by accident, the freedom to build exactly the machine the last disaster had proven necessary. And because this time, the men in charge of planning the invasion let him. This was never really a story about odd-looking tanks. It was a story about an institution's capacity to fail badly, take the failure seriously, and change, and about how unevenly, even within a single army on a single morning, that lesson actually got applied. Percy Hobart's strange machines didn't win D-Day on their own, and it would be wrong to claim they did. But on the beaches where they were trusted and used as intended, they turned an operation that might have failed catastrophically into one that succeeded at a cost lower than almost anyone planning it had dared to hope. On the one beach where they were largely set aside, the cost was paid in full, by men who had been told armor would be waiting for them on the sand. A tank that can swim is a curiosity. A tank that swims because someone finally listened to the men who drowned at Dieppe, that's a lesson written in steel. There's another story hiding just behind this one, about the German commander on the other side of these beaches, who had spent 2 years predicting almost exactly how and where the invasion would come, and was overruled. We'll get into that one soon. If you want it when it's out, you know what to do.